If you walked via the streets of Miami, Florida, in the middle of the 70s, you'll have noticed an abnormal phenomenon that confused the locals and delighted the shopkeepers. The finest earring stores, the luxurious vehicle dealerships, and the excessive give-up digital stores had been no longer full of American millionaires or Arab oil sheikhs or European aristocrats. They were full of Venezuelans. They had been anywhere. They were loud. They have been glad, and that they have been quite wealthy. They moved in packs, families of 10 or 12, navigating the malls of Florida like conquering armies. They had a nickname, many of the merchants of the Sunshine Nation. They were referred to as the daimios. This interprets simply to offer me, because whilst a Venezuelan liked a couple of Italian footwear, he didn't purchase one pair. He said, "Give me one for me and one for my pal." When he offered a color TV, which became the wonder of the age, he said, "Give me two. One for the dwelling room and one for the toilet." They paid in cash. They carried suitcases full of US bucks that had been crisp and new smelling of the bank vaults in Caracas. They offered condos in Brickell and mansions in Coral Gables without asking the fee. They tipped waiters with 800 bills. To the common Americans struggling with the recession and inflation of the Carter years, the people appeared like sight visitors from any other planet, a planet product of gold. Back in Caracas, the skyline become reworking earlier than the eyes of the world. It become a metropolis of production crayons and neon lighting, a concrete jungle growing quicker than any other city within the hemisphere. It became the simplest town in South America, wherein the Concorde, supersonic jet that catered to the worldwide elite, landed frequently. You should fly from Paris to Caracas, and 3 hours arriving in time for a champagne lunch at a French eating place in Altamira that served lobster flown in that morning for Maine. The shops inside the Sabana Grande district bought the modern fashions from Milan and Paris before they even arrived in New York or London. The whiskey consumption in step with capita in Venezuela became the very best in the world. They drank 18 Weir antique scotch, a door, it was water. It became a party that seemed like it might in no way give up. It was the generation of Saudi Venezuela. To recognize this second of madness, this fever dream of intake and abundance, we must understand the phantasm. The International checked out Venezuela and saw a miracle. They noticed a South American state that had in some way cracked the code of improvement. It had a strong democracy wherein power modified palms peacefully every 5 years. It had a developing center elegance that owned cars and houses. And specifically, it had oil, rivers of oil, oceans of oil. But what seemed like a miracle changed into certainly a trap. It turned into a golden cage that became being built bar by means of bar through the worldwide economic device. And the humans in the cage were too inebriated on cheap fuel and pricey scotch to be aware that the door turned into being locked. The story of the Saudi generation starts no longer in Caracas, but thousands of miles away in the deserts of the Middle East. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur struggle broke out. The Arab oil-generating nations, livid at Western sister Israel, declared an oil embargo. They turned off the faucet. The rate of oil did no longer just upward push. It exploded. It quadrupled overnight. It went from $30 a barrel to $12 a barrel in the blink of an eye. It was the largest switch of wealth in human history. Money flowed like a tidal wave from the industrial economies of the United States and Europe into the coffers of the OPEC countries. Venezuela became a founding member of OPEC. In fact, the complete idea of OPEC, the Agency of the Petroleum Exporting International Locations, turned into, in large part, the brainchild of a Venezuelan visionary named Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. He became a wonderful, however austere guy who drove a small car and studied through candlelight to save electricity. He had warned his countrymen years earlier that oil become the devil's excrement. He stated it brings trouble. It brings waste. It brings corruption. He expected that the surprising influx of unearned wealth could rot the soul of the nation. But in 1974, no one became listening to the warnings of a grumpy vintage man. They had been being attentive to the sound of cash registers ringing. The president of Venezuela, the second, changed into a person named Carlos Andres Perez, acknowledged to all people as Cap. He became a charismatic, lively populist who walked fast, talked faster, and wore loud plaid jackets. He took workplace in 1974 just because the tsunami of petrobucks hit the Venezuelan shore. He observed himself in a state of affairs that no leader in records had ever faced. He had an excessive amount of money. The treasury turned into overflowing. The crucial bank literally did now not have sufficient vaults to shop the international reserves. They needed to stack sacks of greenbacks in the hallways of the Ministry of Finance. Carlos Andres Perez declared that Venezuela might use this money to become a primary world state inside a decade. He coined the word "en Venezuela," the awesome Venezuela. His plan became audacious. He desired to nationalize the oil industry, which became nevertheless run with the aid of American corporations like Exxon and Shell. He desired to construct a big metallic industry in the jungle to rival Pittsburgh. He wanted to construct the most important hydroelectric dam in the globe. He wanted to present a scholarship to each student who wanted to take a look overseas. He desired to show Venezuela into a cutting-edge industrial energy that would lead Latin America into the 21st century, and for some years it appeared to work. The authorities released the Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho scholarship software. Tens of lots of younger Venezuelans have been sent to the great universities inside the United States and Europe completely free of rate. They were the kids of mechanics and maids studying at Harvard and Oxford and the Sorbonne. It turned into a noble dream, a big funding in human capital that turned into purported to secure the destiny. But at the back of the dream, the economic system changed into rotting. This is where the concept of the Dutch disease is available in. When a country receives a huge influx of foreign money like bucks from oil, it makes the neighborhood foreign money very strong. The Venezuelan bolivar became pegged to the dollar at a rate of 430. It turned into solid as a rock. You may want to stroll into any bank in Caracas with bolivares and stroll out with bucks, no questions asked. But due to the fact the bolivar became so strong, it became noticeably reasonably priced to import matters from abroad and tremendously costly to provide matters at domestic. Why would a Venezuelan farmer grow corn when he ought to purchase corn from Iowa for one-half the rate? Why might a manufacturing facility in Valencia make shoes when you could import fashion designer footwear from Italy for pennies? The efficient equipment of the USA began to die. Agriculture collapsed. The fields had been abandoned. The farmers moved to the cities to stay inside the shanty cities and live off the government handouts. Venezuela stopped making matters and started buying matters. They imported the entirety. They imported eggs. They imported garments. They imported automobiles. They even imported the sand to construct the concrete skyscrapers because seemingly Venezuelan sand wasn't excellent sufficient. This was the first part of the trap, the addiction to imports. But the second element becomes some distance more risky. It changed into the debt. You might ask why a country that turned into swimming in coins needed to borrow cash. This is the extremely good paradox of the 1970s. The oil money that flooded into Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Iran needed to pass someplace. These countries could not spend all of it fast efficient. So they deposited it inside the safest vicinity they knew, the banks of Wall Street and London, Citibank Chase, Manhattan Bank of America. These banks had been suddenly sitting on mountains of cash deposited via the oil countries they had a hassle. A financial institution does not make cash by means of maintaining coins. It makes cash with the aid of lending cash. They had to locate someone to borrow these billions of dollars. But the United States economic system became in a deep recession. American companies were stagnating. They had been now not borrowing. So the bankers appeared south. They looked at Latin America, and specially they checked out Venezuela. They noticed a rustic with a stable democratic government and the largest oil reserves within the Western Hemisphere. They saw the best borrower. Bankers in highly priced suits flew from New York to Caracas on the Concorde. They stayed in the Tamanacaco Hotel ingesting scotch and assembly with government ministers. They carried briefcases full of mortgage agreements. They didn't await the Venezuelan government to invite for cash. They begged the Venezuelan authorities to take it. They bought the government a myth. They stated, look, oil costs are going to move up for all time. Today oil is $12 a barrel. Tomorrow it is going to be 20, then 50, then 100. If you borrow 1,000 million bucks today, the inflation and the rising oil expenses will make the debt disappear. It is loose cash. It is leverage. The Venezuelan authorities, led by using Carlos Andreas Perez, fell for the pitch, hook, line, and sinker. They started out borrowing frantically. They borrowed to pay for the huge infrastructure tasks that had been going for walks over price range. They borrowed to subsidize the imports, so the humans could hold shopping for cheap whiskey and televisions. They borrowed to cowl the corruption that became draining the treasury. The corruption turned into enormous. When there's that lots of money flowing via a system without checks and balances, it sticks to human beings' palms. Government contracts had been offered to buddies of the party. Ghost corporations had been set up to obtain loans that have been in no way repaid. A fee became charged on each barrel of oil sold and every ton of metal bought. The era of the 12 apostles started out relating to the 12 business tycoons who would become billionaires virtually with the aid of being near the president. They constructed palaces in Caracas and bought islands inside the Caribbean. But the most insidious part of the borrowing become the phrases of the loans. The bankers were smart. They knew that the best instances may not closing for all time. So they wrote the mortgage contracts with floating hobby prices. This meant that the hobby rate Venezuela paid became no longer constant. It changed into tied to the United States prime fee or the London interbank charge. If the hobby costs in the US went up, the bills Venezuela had to make would go up too. Nobody in Caracas paid attention to this element. In the mid-70s, US interest charges had been low. Money was reasonably priced. The party persevered. The government built the Guri Dam, one of the engineering marvels of the sector, which supplied power to the complete U.S. They built the Caracas Metro, a gleaming subway device that changed into cleaner and greater modern day than the New York subway. They constructed the sprawling business complicated of Ciudad Guana in the middle of the jungle. They nationalized the oil enterprise in 1976, growing PDVSA, the country oil company. On that day, they raised the Venezuelan flag over the oil wells and declared financial independence. But it became a whole independence. By the give-up of the 70 seconds, Venezuela had the best in keeping with capita debt within the world. They owed billions to the very equal banks that held their oil deposits. They were recycling their own money, paying hobby to get entry to their personal wealth. It was a shell recreation of worldwide proportions. The society started out to alternate. The way of life of hard paintings and thrift that had characterized the older technology of Venezuelans evaporated. It became replaced by the subculture of clean money. If you wished to process, you didn't look to the private zone. You joined the authorities. The paperwork swelled to vast proportions. There had been elevator operators for elevators that had been automated. There have been gardeners for gardens that didn't exist. There had been experts who never consulted. Everyone changed into on the payroll. The country became the daddy, the mom, and the employer of the country. And the illusion of wealth masked the deep inequality. While the center magnificence flew to Miami, the poor in the ranchos, the slums at the hillsides watched the skyline upward push, however saw little of the gain. They got subsidies, yes, gas become less expensive than water. You should fill the tank of a massive American fuel guzzler for the price of a stick of gum. Bread was artificially reasonably priced, but their colleges had been crumbling and their hospitals were failing. The money changed into being spent on concrete and imports, no longer on human capital. The gap among the Venezuela of the U.S. of the clubs and the Venezuela of the barrios grew wider every day. As the last decade of the 70s got here to a near, the caution symptoms were flashing pink. The oil marketplace became turning into saturated. New oil fields inside the North Sea and Alaska were coming online, breaking the OPEC monopoly. The call for oil was dropping as Western countries have become extra energy efficient. The charge of oil stopped growing. It started out to wobble. In 1979, a new president, Luis Herrera Campins, took office. In his inaugural deal with, he looked at the budget of the state and uttered a phrase that should have terrified absolutely everyone. He stated, "I'm inheriting a mortgaged USA." He noticed the books. He noticed the debt. He noticed that the spending become unsustainable. He saw that for every dollar that came in, $2 were going out. But he couldn't prevent the gadget. The momentum of the spending became too tremendous. The political fee of austerity became too high. The people had been addicted to the subsidies. The Dame-Do mentality changed into ingrained inside the national psyche. People believed that being rich changed into their herbal kingdom. So in place of slicing returned, the government doubled down. They borrowed extra cash to pay the hobby on the antique loans. They played a sport of musical chairs, hoping the music would by no means prevent. But the tune turned into approximately to stop. In Washington, D.C., a person named Paul Volcker turned into appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve. He changed into a giant of a man with a cigar and a venture. His project changed into to kill inflation inside the United States. To do that, he was about to do something that would destroy the Venezuelan dream. He turned into approximately to raise hobby rates to levels never seen before. As we quit the first part of this tale, Venezuela is standing at the precipice. It is 1979. The nightclubs in Caracas are full. The highways are jammed with American cars. The authorities are spending money as though there is no day after today. The banks in New York are counting their profits, but the trap has been set. The floating interest rates are a ticking time bomb. The oil charge is softening, and the U.S. of A. that thinks it is richer than America is ready to discover that it is honestly a debtor dwelling on borrowed time. In the second part of this story, we can see the crash. We will see the day the cash ran out. We will see the notorious Black Friday, the social explosion that observed, proving that the Saudi technology became not anything but a shimmering mirage inside the desert. The 12 months is 1981, and the lure is set to snap close. In America, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, makes a choice on the way to shake the foundations of the global financial system, to combat the runaway inflation of the dollar, which become consuming away on the American financial system. He raises interest prices to 20%. It is a surprise remedy for the American economy, painful, however vital. But for Venezuela, it's miles a dying sentence. Remember the excellent print in the one's loan contracts, the floating hobby fees? Overnight, the hobby bills on Venezuela's massive overseas debt doubled, after which tripled. The country had borrowed billions whilst money priced 5%. Now they had to carry that debt at 20%. At the precise equal time, the oil market collapsed. The glut of oil within the global drove costs down. The perfect typhoon had arrived. Expenses were skyrocketing while earnings turned into plummeting. The vice became tightening. For some years, the government attempted to cover the fact. They burned through their reserves looking to prop up the forex. They stored the accept as true with our pegged at 430 to the dollar. They desired to hold the illusion of the Saudi Venezuela. They wanted the middle magnificence to hold flying to Miami. They wanted the Scotch to maintain flowing. But you cannot fight mathematics. The imperative bank was bleeding bucks. Every day, tens of millions of dollars left the U.S. As fearful investors and rich Venezuelans passed their cash to money owed in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, it became capital flight on a commercial scale. The folks who had benefited most from the increase, the so-known as apostles of development, were the primary to abandon the deliver, taking their billions with them. Then came the day of reckoning, Friday, February 18, 1983. It is a date etched into the memory of each Venezuelan. It is thought surely as Viernes Negro, Black Friday. On that morning, the authorities subsequently admitted defeat. They introduced that they might no longer protect the value of the forex. The bolivar was devalued. The alternate rate of 430, which were the symbol of Venezuelan balance for decades, vanished instantly. The government mounted a complicated device of multiple change prices. However, the truth was brutal. The foreign money crashed. Imagine waking up and finding that your financial savings have misplaced half of their value in a single day. Imagine being an enterprise owner who owes money in greenbacks and your debt has tripled. Imagine being a scholar in London on a government scholarship. And suddenly the take a look at would not arrive, and your credit scorecard stops working, and you are evicted out of your rental. The psychological shock was colossal. The generation of Demedos ended that morning. The flights of the Concorde had been canceled. The purchasing sprees in Miami stopped. The Venezuelan middle elegance, which had felt wealthy and invincible, all of a sudden felt negative and vulnerable. The birthday celebration was over, and the lighting fixtures became on, revealing a messy room complete of damaged glass and unpaid bills. The hangover had began, however the monetary crash became just the start of the soreness. The 1980s have become known in Latin America because the misplaced decade. For Venezuela, it was a slow, painful slide into poverty. The authorities was bankrupt. They should no longer borrow from the global banks because the banks knew they couldn't pay. In truth, the banks have been now the enemy. This is in which the twist of the banking device comes into play. The equal American banks that had nearly forced loans onto Venezuela in the 70s have been now traumatic their money again with competitive ruthlessness. They sent groups of lawyers and accountants to Caracas. They demanded that the authorities cut social spending. They demanded that subsidies be eliminated. They demanded that the state assets be bought. They did not care that the Venezuelan human beings were struggling. They most effective cared about the solvency of their stability sheets. The smiling bankers with the briefcases had been changed with the aid of grim auditors with calculators. The Venezuelan government tried to negotiate. They refinanced the debt again and again. But each refinancing got here with conditions. And every condition intended greater ache for the average citizen. The infrastructure that had been constructed all through the boom began to rot. The roads advanced potholes that swallowed motors. The hospitals ran out of medicine and the equipment broke down. The faculties fell into disrepair. The incredible Venezuela became crumbling earlier than people's eyes. By 1988, the situation was desperate. The man who had presided over the increase, Carlos Andres Perez, determined to run for president once more. He campaigned on nostalgia. He reminded human beings of the good instances. He promised to convey return the abundance. He danced on levels and waved his palms. The human beings determined for hope believed him. They voted him back into office in a landslide. They thought that in reality, through having inside the palace, the oil costs would rise and the bucks might return. The idea he had a magic wand. But when Cap took office in 1989, he determined the cupboard become naked. There turned into no cash. The international reserves had been successfully zero. He had no desire. He had to show to the lender of remaining hotel, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF supplied Venezuela a bailout package deal, a loan of $4 or $5 billion, to stabilize the financial system. But the IMF isn't always a charity. They demanded a strict structural adjustment application. It became known as El Revoyashi, the superflip. The package required the authorities to raise price controls on goods. It required the privatization of nation companies, and most explosively, it required the elimination of the subsidy on gas. For Venezuelans, cheap gasoline became a birthright. It became the one tangible gain they were given from being an oil-rich nation. Raising the price of gas became a taboo. It became the third rail of Venezuelan politics. But Carlos Andrés Pérez, trapped by means of the debt, and the bankers agreed to the terms. He introduced the package on television, telling the humans that the sacrifices have been necessary for the future. On February 27, 1989, the brand new prices went into effect. The charge of gasoline rose, and with it the charge of public transportation. The bus drivers raised their galas. The people dwelling within the commuter cities around Caracas woke up to go to work and found they could not have the funds for the bus trip. It began as a small protest in the metropolis of Guarinas. People started to shout. They began to burn tires. And then, like a spark falling into a pool of gasoline, the anger exploded. The protest unfolded to Caracas. Human beings descended from the ranchos into the city center. But this became not a political march. It was a rise-up. It is known as the Caracazo. For 3 days, the city of Caracas burned. People looted supermarkets. They looted digital shops. They looted buying malls. They had been taking returned what they felt had been stolen from them. They were looting the symbols of the Saudi era that they might not manage to pay for. They carried sides of beef and television sets on their backs. It was the craze of a populace that were promised paradise and given purgatory. The authorities panicked. The police were crushed. Carlos Andrés Pérez, the person who was the hero of the humans, suspended constitutional rights. He dispatched the military into the streets. He gave the order to shoot. The repression became brutal. Soldiers with automated guns fired into the crowds. They fired into the shanty cities. They fired indiscriminately. The official demise toll turned into around 300. However, human rights groups estimate that thousands may additionally have died. Bodies had been buried in mass graves. The Caracazo broke the bond between the human beings and the democratic device. It destroyed the legitimacy of the conventional political events. It destroyed the parable of Venezuelan exceptionalism. The illusion of the 70s had led at once to the massacre of the 80s. The wealth had been entice. By borrowing in opposition to the destiny, Venezuela had mortgaged its stability. The U.S. banking system had profited at the manner up, amassing massive fees for arranging the loans and protecting the deposits, and they profited on the manner down, getting bailed out via the IMF packages that squeezed the Venezuelan people to pay the hobby. The psychological scourge of this period cannot be overstated. It created a deep resentment against America and in opposition to capitalism. The humans felt tricked. They felt that the wealth in their nation were looted by means of a conspiracy of foreign bankers and corrupt local elites. They checked out the rusting skeletons of unfinished production initiatives and noticed monuments to robbery. They checked out the politicians and noticed liars. It turned into, in the surroundings of spoil and anger, that a younger Navy officer named Hugo Chavez noticed his commencing. 3 years after the Caracazo in 1992, he launched a coup trial. He failed militarily, but he succeeded politically. He advised the human beings that the gadget turned into run. He told them that the oil wealth belonged to them. He tapped into the nostalgia for the misplaced wealth and the anger at the betrayal. When he spoke, he wasn't just speaking about politics. He turned into talking about the broken promise of the Saudi technology. The Saudi technology proved that cash is not wealth. Wealth is productivity. Wealth is schooling. Wealth is institutions. Venezuela had cash. However, it did not have the institutions to control it. It suffered from the useful resource curse in its maximum acute form. The oil made the state autonomous from society. The authorities failed to want taxes from the people, so it didn't need to listen to the human beings. It handiest had to please the worldwide oil markets and the global bankers. When the oil markets turned and the bankers grew to become, the country collapsed. The tragedy of the Dame Dos era is that they had been making an investment in a modern USA. However, they were just spending their inheritance on a party. They awoke with a hangover that has lasted for 40 years. Today, in case you go to Caracas, you can still see the remnants of that technology. You can see the futuristic architecture of the 70s, now stained and crumbling. You can see the skeletons of buildings that were in no way completed status like tombstones. And in the minds of the older era, you could nevertheless locate the reminiscence of the time while the Concorde landed at Meta Airport, and the Venezuelan side road became the envy of the world. But it smiles a sour memory, because they recognize now that the wealth changed into not real. it became a mortgage taken out towards their children's destiny. And the bills on that loan are nonetheless being made these days in the shape of poverty migration and the destruction of a kingdom that one dreamed of being the brilliant Venezuela. The banks were given their money lower back. The politicians were given their kickbacks, but the people were given the invoice. And the bill changed into the whole lot they had. The story of Saudi Venezuela is the tale of Icarus flying too near the sun on wings, product of oil and borrowed bucks, most effective to fall crashing into the sea. This is John, and that is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay beforehand of the curve, due to the fact whilst the history books are written, you'll need to be a number of the few who saw it.